Well, the title of my talk is Why Our Democracy Needs Thucydides. And I am, to a certain extent, I share some kinship with you because I'm not a Thucydides expert as much as I am a Thucydides and international relations expert. I wrote on that topic for several years, and I've come back to it from time to time, but a lot of these folks know a lot more than I do about Thucydides. But I like this invitation that I got because it stretches me a little bit to think about Thucydides in America and what Thucydides may say to us about being citizens in a democracy. So that's what I focused on in my paper. My method was a little unconventional too. Of course, I went back to the primary text. That's important. But I also got online and I went out and I looked at, I had these questions in my mind that I think probably a lot of you, students in particular, have had as you've been at this conference for as much as you've been. What would Thucydides have to say about some of the issues that are going on today? And I came up with some headlines of my own. So here's some of my headlines. First of all, Donald Trump, Cleon, or Alcibiades? How would Thucydides understand the concept fake news? Or more seriously, how would Thucydides measure the strength of our democracy? Those kinds of questions I'm sure have popped into many of your minds this weekend. They're kind of underlying, they're under the surface of what we're doing here. Now, when I went online and looked into the blogosphere for some inspiration, I found these headlines. The Mytilenean Dialogue from 428 BC explains who really won the Trump-Clinton debate. What would Thucydides have thought about Donald Trump? That was a headline I found twice by two different people. Can we learn from Thucydides' writings on the Trump of ancient Athens and Thucydides on Donald Trump and New York values? And finally, to Donald Trump, love Thucydides. It wasn't a love letter. And in the midst of doing this, it jogged my memory about a piece that I read not long after 9/11 in the Chicago Tribune. And then later on it appeared in a textbook that I used, a book of readings that I had some of my students read. Piece by Danielle Allen, who is a Harvard professor of political thought. In the Chicago Tribune, she wrote about that day on 9/11 when she was scheduled to speak about Thucydides at a classroom at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And it was just happening. And that made me think about my own situation at that point in time. And I was in my office about ready to go to class, and I had the same question Danielle Allen had, which is, do I hold this class? Do I go ahead and talk about, I was going to go in and talk about Machiavelli, that's where we were at. And she was wondering as she was listening to the radio, should I talk about Thucydides, or do I just need to tell these people to go home? Because you have to remember, we didn't know what kind of crisis we were looking at this point in time. My decision was to go ahead and go to class, tell my students, in case they didn't know, what had just happened, that the Twin Towers had been attacked and there was an ongoing terrorist attack. And I told them to go home and be with their friends and family. Danielle Allen chose made a different choice. And that was, well, at first she said, I went back and forth from my radio to walking towards the classroom and back to my radio, and I didn't know what to do. And here's what she said about the way she felt. She said, there's a Greek word for such behavior, this indecision. It's stasis or stasis. As she explained, the most common meaning of stasis is civil war, but it also means paralysis and lack of motion. She was in a state of stasis. And of course, so is much of the country. People in this situation are particularly vulnerable, having been knocked off their immediate agenda, having been perhaps also knocked off their foundational notions of things as fundamental as whether or not they're safe. People are particularly vulnerable and susceptible to being told what to do. And of course, this gets in the way of good citizenship. And a friend of mine reminded me as I was writing this paper about a book that he wrote, or he read first and then made me read. It wasn't too pleasant, but Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, which at least has one lesson in it worth learning. Same sort of thing. When people are in stasis, when they're in a state of crisis, they're more susceptible to being ordered about and told what to do and how to think. And the temptation to step into that void and use it for political purposes is not exclusively felt by one particular political perspective, but it is a thing. So Allen wrote in her piece, "If we really believe that studying these old books is of any use, then now is surely the time to test that proposition. And if there is a book with which to test the proposition, it is surely Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. After all, it's mostly about what happens to democracies in times of crisis." 10 years later, somebody came to K-State, where I teach, Paul Rahe, historian from Hillsdale College, to give a talk at a program that I direct, the Primary Text Certificate program. And what he said resonated with this same sentiment, and he took it in another direction as well that gives more insight onto why we need to read books like the History of the Peloponnesian War. Rahe said that much of what we think we know is given and unquestioned. This, he said, the Greeks called nomos, or custom. Okay? We live in a world in which we're pretty much conditioned by our culture and surroundings and our custom to think a certain way and not to be able to get outside of our parochialism. But he says we also have the capability of what he said was ecstasis, which is getting outside of ourselves and evaluating ourselves. But there has to be a way to do that. He said, how do we achieve this capability of stepping outside of nomos, or custom, and to think in terms of physis, or nature, or truth, if you will? So he said, in the past, the best way to do this was to travel. This was the way of Herodotus. And he said, when you could travel and you could see the rest of the world and you knew that people lived very different ways, spoke different languages, believed different gods, it got you outside of yourself and you were able to see your own country's perspective objectively. Okay? But not possible now for a lot of us, because we live in a world that's been globalized, in which the American culture pretty much reigns supreme in a lot of the world. Rahe said there's a kind of sameness creeping over the world, and the consequence is that the entire world is becoming educated to be American. The fundamental pressure comes from us. The consequence is that when you travel today, you meet yourself. Just a little humorous example of this. A long time ago, on my first trip abroad, I was in Belgium, heading for a Model UN conference there. Went for breakfast. Things are looking a little different, but I'm sitting down having this wonderful experience of foreignness for the first time, and on the radio comes Billy Ray Cyrus, "Don't Break My Heart, My Achy Breaky Heart." If you don't know that song, God bless you, you're lucky. And it just was like, it just ruined my whole breakfast. Because I don't like country music anyway. And, you know, in that whole trip, what did I hear? I heard American television, American music, etc. So I think the point well taken. It's hard to get outside of yourself and be objective and think objectively about your own country, especially if you're American, because you meet America everywhere. McDonald's, American music, it's everywhere. So Ray said, so what's the answer? We can't travel to get this insight, so what do? He said, we travel through time. Okay? And how can we do that? Well, the only way we know, unless we're Doctor Who, is to use old texts to study history, and that's the primary reason for reading something like the History of the Peloponnesian War. So, in the spirit of both of those inspirational figures, Daniel Allen and Paul Rahe, I'm drawn to the case of Coursera, related in the third and fourth books of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, with the hope of objectively meditating on the causes and effects, and thus hopefully the avoidance of stasis, which keeps us from being able to think and make decisions for ourselves and be democratic citizens. So just briefly, the Corcyraean Civil War began in the 5th year of the war and began when a group of 250 Corcyraean oligarchs were captured by Corinth. The Corinthians released them on the promise that they would go back home and encourage their friends to revolt against the Democratic Party. The former prisoners went home and lobbied their case with their fellow oligarchs. And while remaining allied with Democratic Athens, their arguments caused Corcyra to adopt a friendlier attitude towards the Corinthians and the Spartans. This change in position knocked the population off their equilibrium. They had been a democracy. And from then on, the oligarchs and the people were at war. So hence, the Civil War began. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, which nobody is going to remember, and I probably can't either. But I did draw out some significant highlights that I think help us think about what is universal in a situation like this. Okay. First, the stasis that eventually engulfed Corcyra was instigated by an outside power aligned with Sparta, namely Corinth. The Corinthians deliberately sent oligarchic prisoners they held to foment a rebellion for their parties so as to get Corcyra into the Spartan orbit. The ideological dimension of this move and the subsequent conflict always surprises students new to Thucydides. They tend to think that ideological warfare only got underway with the French Revolution or maybe World War II, but it goes back to ancient times. Second, there are numerous instances of shocking impiety where people in this civil war broke all the rules of their religion, including crashing into temples and killing people who had taken refuge in their temples. It was a prohibited thing to do that. And Thucydides describes in great detail the slaughters and the great crimes that occurred within the temples. Third, Thucydides said that ideology in this civil war oftentimes covered up baser motivations. And that's something I think that's particularly important for democratic citizens to remember. Lots of times what you hear as the reason why people do things in politics is not really the reason. At least that was Thucydides' opinion. He said that the combatants, quote, slew such of their enemies as they laid hands on. They were engaged in butchering those of their fellow citizens whom they regarded as their enemies. And although the crime was imputed, the crime imputed was that of attempting to put down the democracy. Some were slain for private hatred, others by their debtors because of monies owed them. And so they used the cloak of ideological warfare to take revenge on their enemies and get the money and the things that they wanted. Fourth, there was an ever-increasing pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. So as time went by, he describes what I would call bloodlust, where people, at a certain point, there's a certain amount of violence where people completely lose perspective and take pleasure in killing and destruction for its own sake. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip over most of the example that I have here, but I'll read a little bit of it. These oligarchs that they had imprisoned, they succeeded in drawing them out. The people did. He says it was so arranged that the men were caught sailing out in the boat that was provided. The treaty became void. Accordingly, the whole were given up to the Corcyraeans. For this result, the Athenian generals were in great measure responsible. Their evident disinclination to sail for Sicily and thus to leave others the honor of conducting the men to Athens encouraged the intriguers in their design and seemed to affirm the truth of their representations. The prisoners thus handed over were shut up by the Corcyraeans in a large building, afterwards taken out by 20s and led past 2 lines of hoplites, one on each side, being bound together and beaten and stabbed by the men in the lines whenever any saw pass a personal enemy, while men carrying whips went by their side and hastened on the road those that walked too slowly. And many of these prisoners, decided to kill themselves once they figured out what was going on rather than face what was left, which is another thing that is brought up twice by Thucydides in this episode, is that people in desperation killed themselves out of it wasn't considered an impiety, but out of an attempt to have some control over their lives in this situation. And finally, and most importantly, Thucydides notes a radicalization in language, in the use of language, that becomes, he really goes hard into the paint in this particular spot. There's 2 whole pages of description about how language changed and how people changed their hardcore values. I'll just read one example here, maybe. Words, he said, had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be the cloak of unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Cautious plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. A little bit further down, revenge also was held of more account than self-preservation. Oaths of reconciliation being offered on either side to meet an immediate difficulty only held good so long as no other weapon was at hand. And generally speaking, anybody who was previously held to be wise and had any sort of prudence was now considered a child and of no account. Now, several authors have observed what Thucydides described regarding language and attitudes changing as reminiscent of revolutionary newspeak. That is the same kind of language and version described by George Orwell in his famous dystopian novel 1984. Of course, this probably reminds us of something more immediately familiar. Recently, we've been apprised of alternative facts, close enough to Orwell's newspeak. Forgotten men and women, a phrase straight out of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. And enemies of the people, a phrase Corsairian Democrats, French revolutionaries, and Vladimir Lenin would all have in common. In this era, which admittedly was a long time in the making, Thucydides' observations again remind us what seems now unsettling and even disturbing. And it's actually old. It is the latest manifestation of a particular tendency of human nature that comes out in times of high crisis. Skip over that. No, I've got time. All right, so what were these causes for extremism? First, Thucydides said, war takes away the easy supply of daily wants and so makes a rough taskmaster that brings most men's character to a level with their fortune. So stress is a factor in creating extremism. But 2, and this is a point I've already made, but I want to hammer in, leaders radicalize people with fair words in order to gain power for themselves. Okay? So there are many followers who believe the ideological spin of leaders, and they do the work for leaders who tend to be non-ideological, who tend to use rhetoric to stir people up and get them to do what they want to do. Fair words get credulous people who really have nothing to gain by getting involved to risk their lives for those who do. In fact, it is among them where we find the true believers. It is among true believers that we're most likely to find those who are moved to such hatred of their ideological enemies that they exhibit the cruelty referenced above. So, one last thought. I'm almost done. In a book I read recently, Not for Profit, by Martha Nussbaum, Nussbaum carries the point made by Daniel Allen and Paul Ray a bit further by pointing out, strangely enough, America's university education still has far more humanistic content, more required history, philosophy, and literature than the average university of education in Europe. University education. However, Nussbaum reports that this type of education is under serious threat in the United States. American educational institutions have always leaned towards pragmatism, but in the past few decades, they have been under severe pressure to produce, in the sense of factory production, students who get lucrative jobs. Now, there's nothing wrong at all with getting a job after you graduate, but as Nussbaum points out, students who get mainly a technical education are actually less employable and probably promotable in the long run because they do not have the necessary ability to learn, communicate, and create and adapt. More to her point, such students are not equipped to fulfill their roles as free democratic citizens who can exchange their rights to not only vote judiciously but to participate more fully in the life of their communities. This, she seems to be saying, is the main reason why communities are fraying and our political environment has become ever more dysfunctional. But, okay, so what can we learn from Thucydides, especially on his account of the Corcyraean stasis, is not that that it is not acceptable to simply wave the white flag of surrender and allow elites the opportunity to do the thinking for us, whether those elites have good ideas or not. Instead, the fair words of ideology, especially in times of stress, need to be taken with some skepticism by those who want to hold on to their liberty, because there is always a chance that those words are being used not to enlighten but to divide and to inflame the impassions of those who will be on the front lines. Healthy skepticism, one outcome of a good education requiring us to read books like the history of the Peloponnesian War, does entail a loss of happy innocence, but is perhaps what it takes to make a democracy work, even in the inevitable crisis.